Welcome back to NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. We're spending some time talking with the experts from Boehringer Ingelheim Vetmedica Incorporated about biosecurity, a very important issue for all cattlemen. Well, gentlemen, let's take a couple of minutes talking about introducing new cattle into the herd. And Dr. Larson, I'll start with you. What are some thoughts relative to quarantining cattle when we purchase and bring new cattle into our herd?
One of the things that we should do is whenever we bring new cattle into the herd, commonly replacement heifers or bulls that are coming onto the herd, but also if we buy some pregnant cows or really anybody we bring onto the farm, we're concerned about diseases that might pass pretty quickly from those new cattle to our resident herd. So the types of diseases where if there's going to be a problem, it's going to be pretty soon. So we need a quarantine long enough to really get through that time period. And it's hard to say exactly what that number should be. Generally, people aim for 30 days to 6 weeks as a time frame to isolate the cattle that are new away from the resident herd. And I should really clarify, that's 30 days or 6 weeks of those cattle being healthy. So if those new cattle break with the disease, 2 weeks into our quarantine, we extend the quarantine time because I want them to completely get over that. I want them to quit shedding whatever virus or bacteria is causing the problem and have time to completely get over that before I expose them to the rest of the herd. That's really important for diseases where it is confined in time to a fairly short period of time. But we also have diseases that have basically lifelong carriers. And several of the diseases that we've talked about, like BVD and trichomoniasis, but also anaplasmosis and other diseases, really once you're infected, there's the potential, at least in some of those animals, to be infected for life. And so in that case, a 6-week quarantine isn't going to solve that problem. The good thing is for a lot of those diseases, we also have tests that can identify those carrier animals, because in this case, we're talking about carrier animals that don't appear sick. And so what we really talk about with quarantine is it's the perfect time to, yes, quarantine those animals, keep them away from my resident herd, but also do some testing at the beginning. And that might be a blood test, it might be an ear notch test, it might be testing bulls, which is scraping the prepuce. So, several different ways that we talk about testing, and we can do that at the beginning and maybe again in the middle of that quarantine period, because we're trying to protect our herd from those diseases that might come along very quickly or that might be due to these more long-term carriers.
Gotcha. Dr. Devin, what would you add?
Well, it's also important to think about where we're going to quarantine these cattle, right? Do we want to quarantine them in the corrals that we would routinely use to process baby calves 2 weeks later? That's not a good idea, obviously. But we want to quarantine them in such an area that we can confine anything that they may leave behind in terms of contagious pathogens perhaps that are shed in the feces, the urine, and that sort of thing. So maybe we receive them into a dry lot situation. We hold them for a good length of time. The other thing we haven't really talked about, we've been talking about primarily reproductive disease, but when we bring in new cattle, particularly from outside of a geographic area, they may be carrying weed seed. They might be carrying parasites that we don't want to introduce onto the ranch. Or at least if we do, we want to confine them to an area where that risk will go away over time. Maybe we get the seeds to sprout and we deal with that, or the parasites have time to die and we treat the animals on arrival. So where we receive them is a pretty important situation. Maybe it's dry lot, maybe it's a trap that we don't use again for 12, 18 months. If we're receiving routinely, maybe we're getting a load of cattle a week or something like that, now we've got a plan for contingency to keep the load that came in last week separate from the load that's coming this week, because the risk may be different. So there's a lot of things to plan for and plan contingencies around.
Some things that we often overlook, clearly. Dr. Payne, I guess I'd ask you a question. As we think about where we pasture cattle and what cattle we pasture next to which other cattle, what are some of the recommendations you'd give us in that regard?
The two groups that I feel are most vulnerable on a cow-calf operation would be pregnant cows or groups that have young calves in them. So I'd be very cautious what cattle you put beside, if at all, beside those two particular groups.
Kevin?
Well, we'd really like to keep 2 fences between groups of cattle, especially stocker cattle and cows, but I don't particularly want another set of cows that I may not be familiar with next to my bred cows. And so it's real important, if we can, to plan things like our pasture rotations where we have different rotations where we can keep some space between these cattle. And sometimes we may need to do it between groups on our own ranch. We also need to, once again, talk to our neighbors, work with them. This may be where you both sit down and talk about your pasture rotation programs, where we can keep some space in between cattle and everything. And we generally think of biosecurity about things coming in on us and things like that, but we need to remember also that the problem may start on us, and we need to be a good neighbor. I don't want that problem starting on me and going to my neighbors, so we need to be cognizant of that. And so when we design new fences, when we design new structures, we need to remember not just maybe to do it because of grazing management, but we need to keep biosecurity in mind also, because this really helps keep those cattle apart sometimes. And just think about when we build new structures. Maybe we decide we're going to run cows and calves, and we're going to manage our grazing and what we have with some additional stocker cattle. Well, we need to be cognizant that when we've got those new facilities that we may build to handle them, or we may need to have separate facilities on the ranch just to have good sanitation and not cross-contaminate something.
Do you have anything to add?
Sure. You know, one thing I want people to think about, and this comes from experience going through packing plants, as many have been through those here in the past, but what I've always found interesting about a packing plant is that on the tours you start out in fabrication and packaging, and you wind up finishing the tour at receiving. And the reason for that is simply because you want to start out in the most sterile environment in the packing plant, going to the most non-sterile environment. And so I encourage people to think about, as they're processing animals or how to manage cattle flow on their operation, that they keep that in their mind. We work the cattle that are at lowest risk or the healthiest animals first, and then we focus on those that are sick later on. So we don't include that cross transmission of diseases.
Real practical tool. Dr. Devin, here in Colorado, there's a number of us that transport cattle to summer pasture or cornstalk pasture, what have you. What kind of considerations should we keep in mind for those of us that do transport cattle every year?
Well, your risk in transportation is what was hauled in that truck before your cattle were, right? So we want to have clean trailers, clean trucks, and make sure there's not a backhaul involved. You know, classic example, we've had a lot of cattle move out of Texas and go east.
Sure.
You know, what if we send a load of cows east and they're in a truck that came with high-risk cattle coming from somewhere else? So we know that some of these pathogens can live for an extended period of time in manure and urine, and so it's important to have those transport equipment good and clean and sanitized before you start loading, particularly pregnant animals on them.
Yeah, well, that's some great pragmatic advice here. When we return, we'll talk with our expert panelist about ways to make sure the vaccines you select for your operation have a fighting chance. Stay with us. We'll be right back.